It's episode 117 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. I've got a fantastic show for you today with Robin Hobb. But before we get to that, I'd like to tell you about a couple of our sponsors. Ellen Campbell is one of the best indie editors out there. If you're an author and you need someone to help you find the perfect vision of your book, Ellen is the person to help you. Find her at ellencampbell.thirdscribe.com. Also go to Amazon, search for her name, Ellen Campbell, and you can see tons of some of the best indie books out there that she has edited. ellencampbell.thirdscribe.com. Also, The White Dragon Genesis. If you listen at the end of this episode, there's another audiobook snippet from this newly released audiobook. I narrated it. Stefan Boltz wrote this amazing story, and I hope you'll listen. And just like last week, I'm going to give away 5 free copies of the audiobook. If you'll email me at authorhankgarner@outlook.com, I'll send a free audiobook to the first 5 people. Find links to it in the show notes. Also, we've got a new sponsor this week, John Gregory Hancock. Don't forget the Gregory. John Gregory Hancock. John Gregory Hancock is a storyteller. He's not tied to any one genre, but writes in science fiction, fantasy, horror, and a great mixture of the 3. He's featuring 2 books this week, The Mortuary Arts and Roof. The Mortuary Arts is about Catherine O'Donnell, who was born with a disfiguring strawberry birthmark across the bottom of her face. In 1880s London, that was enough to discourage suitors. Love was something for which she yearned, but never found within her reach. But out of necessity, she became adept at hiding inside her home and behind makeups. She formulated and applied herself. When tragedy upended her modest life and dumped her out onto the streets, she was bereft of options. Desperate, she answered an advertisement for a mortuary assistant, applying makeup to cadavers. She knew what she had to do when asked what skills she possessed that qualified her for the position. Kate brazenly used her kerchief to wipe away the concealing powders and stand before them, birthmark revealed and prominent. She learned to find beauty in her newfound art, forming masks to make the dead resemble the living. If only her education had ended there. A Victorian-era novella of growing suspense and horror. Also, Roof. Roof is about Peter Harkness. He's a brilliant prototype engineer and one of the few humans lucky enough to score a job at a company that designs automatons. The irony is not lost on him. Corporations are manufacturing countless automatons to replace human workers and not just in menial jobs. His first day of work is spent gingerly avoiding the numerous protest zones of the jobless that appear along his route. He hunches his shoulders and pulls his head down as he passes by. He understands their anger, but he has no choice. He must eat. It's a devil's bargain. He makes uneasy allies where he least expects and finds enemies that were waiting for him all along. Peter must determine how or if he will deal with the madness around him. Merely crunching numbers won't be enough. It's a near-future dystopian world reminiscent of Asimov, Heinlein, and the golden age of science fiction. Be sure to check out the work of John Gregory Hancock. Find links to it in the show notes here, or go to Amazon.com and search for John Gregory Hancock. Now, on to our fantastic show with Robin Hobb. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Robin Hobb on the show. Robin is one of the modern masters of fantasy literature, and I'm very humbled and thankful to have you on the show. Welcome.
Oh, well, I really enjoy being here. I'm not sure that I would refer to myself as a modern master, but
well, I will. You don't have to. So. First off, I begin with a variation of the same question for all my guests, and that question is, what is your very first memory of wanting to be a writer?
My very first memory of actually sitting down with a pencil and trying to write, I would have been probably in October of entering 3rd grade, which I'd skipped 2nd grade, so I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and I wanted to write a story on Halloween. Prior to that, when you're in 1st grade, at that time, I didn't have a lot of access to a library, so when I had read everything that I could read within my household library, I remember wishing that I could make more stories.
Neat. So, what was it that initially attracted you? That do you know what it was that made you want to tell that story to come up with a Halloween story?
Oh, I think I think every kid loves Halloween stories, and they want them to be a little bit scary, but not too scary.
Right.
But mostly it was just to write a story that I wanted to read myself.
Gotcha. Did you share that with anyone?
Oh, the story itself?
Yeah.
I remember I was sitting at the table. I had 5 brothers and sisters in the house, so I'm sure I inflicted that on somebody. But it was also getting ready to go trick or treating, so there would not have been a lot of time to waste on forcing a sibling to read it.
Nice. So after that, was there anyone in your life that encouraged you to pursue writing, or maybe someone who provided you with lots of reading material?
For a family, we had a lot of books in our house. We had my father's old fairy tale books with beautiful, beautiful illustrations, so that from the beginning, fantasy was something that was beautifully illustrated. And then we had the World Book and the Book of Knowledge. And at that time, the Book of Knowledge was full of it was not an encyclopedia. It was a very old edition that was full of stories and poems and all kinds of articles. Just you could just pick it up and read anything in there. So it was a lot of fun, and my older siblings would go to a library, and I remember when we were finally allowed to use the bookmobile at school, which increased the size of our rather small public school library. So there were always opportunities to find books.
What was it that endeared you to fantasy?
I think it's the idea that anything can happen, that there are no boundaries, no limits. If you're a small child and you're reading Dick and Jane, it's going to be very much what we call now experiential fiction, meaning we're going to read about going to the store or something. And to this day, I will pick up a piece of a mainstream book, and I will start reading it, and inevitably, it seems to me, a lot of them are just very sad little lives. And I go, why do I want to read about somebody's sad little life?
Right.
Why don't I would prefer to read something extraordinary, something where possibilities exist by the multitude in an infinite variety. I think possibly my early reading, which was a lot of fairy tales and mythology and legend, led me to desire that kind of storytelling too.
Did your surroundings as a young person affect that at all?
Well, when I was up to about age 10, we lived in suburban California. And then when I was about 10, we moved to Alaska. And I don't really think necessarily that my surroundings, drove me to fantasy. It wasn't like I couldn't go outside and play in California and ride my bike and do the things that, unfortunately, most kids don't seem to get to do now.
Right.
And in Alaska, I was always outside, but the winters were very long and very dark. So there was probably more time for reading and doing puzzles and things like that. At the time in Fairbanks, there were exactly 2 television stations, and one of them was the military station that broadcast interesting little documentaries on things, and then and TV signed off very early. I think it's hard for people to understand that the idea of a wide variety of shows that simply did not exist. And if I wanted to watch something, I had to be there in front of the TV set to watch it at the designated time.
Right.
So it was a very different world in terms of electronic entertainment. But books are always there.
Right. I think that the idea that TV actually signed off is a foreign concept now.
Mm-hmm. And they would have the peacock when they signed on to, if you're fortunate enough to have a color TV, you could adjust the color settings on your set, or the Indian chief with the full headdress.
Right.
And they usually played the Star Spangled Banner at sign-off time.
Right. I remember that very well. Very well. At what point did you decide that you were going to write your first novel?
My first novel. I think I started out as a writer with the mistaken idea that writing shorter works for children was easier. And it's not. You work with a limited vocabulary, and you have to tell a very good story in like 500 or 700 words. It's very difficult, actually, but it does teach you exactly what a story is, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and something changes or happens in there. From writing for kids, I went on to attempting longer works for children, which did not sell. I began to write fantasy and science fiction, and in those areas, I began to venture towards longer lengths. But I knew that I wanted to write a novel, but it wasn't until I actually took two longer stories and said these would fit together and be a novel that I created a novel.
When you were working on your children's fiction, did you get any of that published anywhere?
Oh yes, I wrote for some of them were just little like little Sunday school papers, the little handouts you get in a classroom. I wrote for Humpty Dumpty and Jack and Jill children's fiction magazines that don't really I don't think they're around anymore. Highlights for Children is still around.
Right.
I wrote some material for SRA, Science Research Associates, which are the little color-coded cards you get in elementary school as you advance through the levels of reading. So I wrote for a variety of the small magazines and things like that. Sometimes I put get to put a Christmas story in the local newspaper or something like that.
Nice. Where did the idea, I think a lot of people, me especially, know you best or came to know you through your Farseer trilogy.
Yes.
And The Assassin's Apprentice. Kind of tell me how that book came to be and kind of what was going on in your life when the character of Fitz came into your life.
For most of my best book ideas happen when two unrelated ideas collide. And so I've told this story before, but working on other works, I would get ideas, and this was, pre-computer days. This is when I was working on a typewriter, so you can't open a file and save that idea. You have to write it down on something. And I would scribble those ideas down and then open the desk drawer and drop them in and go back to what I was working on, because you can't let yourself be distracted by the next sparkly story. You have to finish the one you're on. So for a long time, there was a torn flap off a white envelope in my desk drawer, and on it was written, "What if magic was addictive and the addiction was totally destructive?" And that was in there for a long time. And the other idea that kind of interfaced with that eventually was the idea that we have all these cliches in fantasy, and cliches are cliches for a reason. They speak to us. The idea of once upon a time, there was a young person who set out to seek his fortune in the world, and he meets a wise woman along the way, and then a gruff but kind-hearted person who helps him. All these characters are very much cliches. But I wanted to take some of the cliche characters and see if I could knock the rust off them and make them speak to people again. So those two ideas together became pretty much the basis for the Assassin's Apprentice.
How long did it take you to write that book?
In terms of inspiration, I had that book in my head for several years, and then to actually write it took me about a year. Because of the way my deadlines are structured, one of the rules of time and motion studies is that work expands to fill the time allotted for it.
Right.
And so it takes me about a year to write a book.
Gotcha. What were you doing professionally at that time?
Oh, let's see. For Assassin's Apprentice, let me think. Da 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 da. I had been a carrier for the U.S. Mail, a rural route driver, which means that you use your car and you sit on the wrong side of the car and drive with your left foot and deliver mail out through the passenger side to mailboxes on sticks, by the side of the road on posts. So I had been doing that. And at that time, though, I was at home because I had just, my youngest child had been born. And so I was doing a lot of writing while she was a tiny baby.
I think a lot of people are in that position where they try to balance their creative outlets with raising a family, working a full-time job like you were. What was the hardest part of that time for you?
Okay. The hardest part was probably when I look up from I've really been enjoying writing Assassin's Apprentice, and I suddenly look up and the deadline is looming. And I know I need to now pour on the hours and finish this book. And I have a small child running around the house who, also needs my hours. And so although we had really rationed television before that, we had our very first VCR. And I allowed her to watch Beauty and the Beast as many times a day as she wanted it. And sometimes that meant it was just like a continuous thing to where her older siblings were actually turning off the sound and they were doing all the dialogue and songs because they had it memorized at that point.
I love it.
So it was some very bad parenting to get to meet that deadline. That was hard.
Was this a self-imposed deadline? Did you have a publisher already lined up for it?
Yes, we had a contract for it, and so it was a publishing deadline.
How did you come to have the contract for that book? Did you already have a relationship with the publisher?
Oh, by that point, I had been writing for a good 10 years, and so I had an agent and a publisher. Yes.
Gotcha. When you started writing the book and you turned it in, did you have any idea that book would become what Assassin's Apprentice has?
No idea at all. And that's the so much of writing is a roll of the dice. I was working in a different slice of the genre than I had worked in before in terms of the fact that I knew it was a big story and it was more traditional epic fantasy, if you would. As Megan Lindholm, I had dabbled in everything from historical fantasy, where it's based somewhat on historical events, but you've injected fantasy elements, to urban fantasy, which for me was Wizard of the Pigeons, futuristic, almost science fiction, which would have been Alien Earth. I've written all across the genre in every slice, but this was the first time I ventured really into epic fantasy. And the honest truth for other people out there who want to be writers was that I didn't work harder on this book than any other book I'd ever written. I just, with the same amount of effort that I had put into every one of my other books, this one succeeded wildly beyond my expectations.
At what point did you realize that this book was special, or maybe special is the wrong word? Maybe it was. At what point did you realize this was going to be the level of success that it did?
Probably 6 months after publication, something like that. And bear in mind that my publisher really put the shoulder to the wheel with that book in terms of they put a free copy of it into the programming bags at the I think it was the World Fantasy Convention that year. So from the beginning, it was getting into the hands of people who loved fantasy. And that was a huge advantage, and they gave me a beautiful cover by Michael Whalen, one of my all-time favorite fantasy artists. And in the UK, they gave me a John Howe cover, and John was not as well known then as he is now, but definitely it was a striking cover. And those kinds of extra pushes by the publisher to get it out, to make people want to pick it up, I think that definitely helped.
So having a good cover, having a fan base, if you will, that it was already primed for the kind of novel that it was, to build a little groundswell and a little chatter about the book definitely helped.
Oh, yes, that word of mouth always helps. And the fact is that there are many people who will actually go out and buy a book with a cover by Michael Whelan simply because they love Michael Whelan's art so much, and I don't blame them at all. And if that's why they bought Assassin's Apprentice, I'm perfectly happy with that. But I think, it's that undefinable thing of that book at that time spoke to people for whatever reason. And it has continued to speak to people. I get a lot of letters still about, people who have just met Fitz and are now looking forward to following him through quite a number of books of his adventures. Why it works? Possibly the deliberate use of our very beloved cliches, but with an effort to not make them be a cliche anymore.
Expound on that a little bit, because I think, I've talked to numerous fantasy authors, and we all, tend to write with the same toolkit, or a very similar toolkit. I won't say same, but a lot of our tools and tropes and things like that are very similar. But the magic is when the author can take those things that we're all familiar with and weave a story that is completely fresh and new and takes us literally to another world. As a fantasy author, is that a conscious thing, or is it just part of your skill? Like, how do you take those cliches, like you said, or those tropes, or whichever word we want to use, but make them fresh?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is break it down to its most basic level. And I don't know any teenager who does not secretly harbor the hope that there is something special about yourself that you don't know. And that's whether you're 11 years old and really hoping that a letter from Hogwarts will come, or finding, we all feel that we all long for recognition, I think. And so Fitz, as a character, is somebody who is, he is of royal lineage, but he still has to make his own way. That recognition is there, but it's not an acknowledgement. And so he's a character that I think offers that fantasy, which is there is something special about you that other people don't quite know yet. And as he discovers what his abilities are, and that some of them are not socially acceptable and others are not as strong as he could wish them to be, you've got, what in some ways you could say that's the high school experience. It's finding out that maybe you are top notch at math, but that doesn't make you part of the cool kids. And on the basketball team, you're warming the bench. And so, I think there's an entry level there for people who I would not identify with a hero who, if she is beautiful and rich and athletic, and she's the best swordsman and woman, and at the same time she can do magic, and she has the most beautiful horse that loves her. Right away, I'm saying I never get to be that person in life, and I don't identify with that character that's going off to save the world simply because she has everything in her toolbox. I identify more with a character who has challenges and limitations. And so I think that a lot of people like Fitz for that he isn't. He's not the star. He doesn't get the recognition, and he doesn't always do it right. And he makes decisions that are not the most intelligent decision. that in hindsight that he could make. So I think having a character where people can step into the book and say, I identify with this character, is important.
Is there a challenge in creating a character that people can relate to almost, having a character that you can relate to without just going into pitying the character? When we first meet Fitz, he's a bastard. He's a small child. He's kind of thrown away. How do you balance caring about the character without just, feeling just pity for the character and not wanting to see them succeed? Does that make sense?
I think it's in the attitude of the character himself or herself. When you're writing from the first person viewpoint, you have the opportunity to put the reader into the mind of the character. And if the character is always pitying herself, then I'm going to rapidly grow weary of that. I know enough people like that in real life.
Right.
But if the character is saying, okay, this happened to me, it's not what I wanted, how do I get around it? What do I do? And it's not somebody else coming in and fixing it for them. It's the character picking themselves up and saying, and now I go on. I think everybody can identify with that because that's what we all have to do every day. You get up and you've got your work day outlined and you've got to get the kid to daycare by 8 and you've got to be at work at 8:30 and there's an important meeting at 8:45 and you walk out and you've got a flat tire. And, either you scream and cry and fall on the ground or you get out the jack and you fix the tire or you borrow somebody's car. But it's, I think people like a character who say, and I went on anyway, because that's what we all have to do.
What year was that book originally published?
I don't know. Okay, let me do the math. Let me do the math. 92?
How has fantasy changed in that time? You see a difference in the kind of books that fans want to read?
Oh, I think we have been through so many changes since the beginning of my writing career. There was a time when horror was very, very strong, and that was absorbing a lot of the shelf space in bookstores. And now I don't see that so much anymore. And science fiction used to be a much stronger category than fantasy. And we had cyberpunk and the new wave of things, and there's always a new something that comes up. And right now, we have a lot of steampunk right now, so we have all these waves of things. But basically, to me, it's all fantasy still. So one of the things that I definitely saw change was that when I was first began writing, paperbacks were a much shorter length. And I was even told you can't make your book longer because the binding won't stand up. So you need to stop at this word length. And when I did write a story that was too long, which was Reindeer People, they split it into 2 books because it was simply too long. And I had to find a good place to stop the story and then a good place to restart it again. So the idea that you have that great big fat fantasy was something that I lived with. And I still really admire the writers from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s who told wonderful stories in far shorter page lengths than I'm allowed. So I definitely saw the advent of the gigantic fantasy, probably the Wheel of Time. The first time I saw that, the first volume, Eye of the World, I think, in a bookstore, I was absolutely shocked. It looked like a brick on the bookshelf next to all of these skinny little paperbacks. Right. So that has been one of the major things I've seen is the idea that people want a great big story where they can move into the world and stay there. And I remember thinking about it in terms of the Wheel of Time, and and the fact that there are people out there who they stayed involved with those characters longer than they stayed married.
Wow.
That they had a long-term relationship with a book and characters that outlasted their real-life relationships. And I think that for some of us, there's that hunger to have that world that you can step sideways into at any time and say, I'm going to go live in my other world for a little while. And that's what a new book is.
And you have you've written a number of books in Fitz's world, and your world has grown rather large, and with several large volumes. In that, is that a challenge as a writer to keep expanding that world and to meet the expectation of the readers, like you were just talking about, that want to step sideways into the world and become part of the story? As a writer, what is that challenge like?
For me, it's keeping track of everything, making sure I'm not contradicting something that I said earlier, making all of the characters, even the minor characters, age at the same rate, keeping the distance between cities consistent. All of the things where you don't want to suddenly eject the reader from your world because you have always said a raven can only cover this much ground in a day, and suddenly you have him covering 3 times that ground because you want him to carry a message there much faster. There's all kinds of little things like that. How old is somebody? Are they left-handed? Do they have red hair? And keeping track of all of that and making sure that when the minor character walks on screen, he looks exactly as he did the last time you saw him, or she has aged appropriately since the last time you saw her. All of that is really, really important. And it's difficult.
Right. Another really crucial element to a lot of fantasy is the magic system. How do you go about creating magic systems? In the Farseer world, you have really interesting magic, in so much that it's not necessarily spell casting, but these telepathic abilities, sort of. How do you go about coming up with something new and imaginative, and how important is the magic system to a fantasy novel?
Well, if you don't have magic, in my opinion, then it's not fantasy. And, so when you've got science fiction, then you've got, things like alternate history and time travel, which I would not necessarily classify as a fantasy. I think a fantasy demands the fantastic in it. As far as magic systems, if you look at the skill and the wit, they, again, from the very olden times, you've had people using this magic. If you want to speak with the tongues of beasts, sometimes it's, you have to kill a bird and eat its tongue, and then suddenly you can understand what birds are saying. There's all kinds of old fairy tales that talk about being gifted with this. You did a favor to a trapped animal and saved him, and now he says, okay, now you can understand the language of all the animals in the woods. That's a very old magazine, very old magic. And if you think about telepathy, again, that's, the idea that you can read other people's minds, or, it's a science fiction concept as well. What if we, develop the ability to read other people's minds? There's nothing really new about those. It's simply, as a writer, setting the limits and saying, can you talk to every single animal? Does that mean you become a vegan? Can you use this skill magic on every single human being? Can you bend everybody to your will, in which case you're so powerful that there's almost no story? So it's setting it up and letting the reader know through the characters what the limits of it are, and then not cheating. If you say that the ring has 3 magic wishes, you can't at the last minute when the hero is in desperate need say, oh, look, we found a fourth magic wish in the ring. That's not fair. You have to play by the rules once you've set them up.
And if you don't play by the rules, readers will let you know.
Oh, yes, and they simply stop reading, or they simply throw the book across the room, or you broke the contract with the reader, which is that, if you will suspend your disbelief, I will tell you a really good story. But that doesn't mean totally discard your disbelief. It means suspend it and listen to the rules I'm going to lay down, and I will play that game. I will play fair.
Have you ever had a reader that kind of called you out on your own story? Like you maybe got a letter or something from a reader that said, you said this, but then you do this, and I don't have a good example, but have you ever had that happen with a reader?
I haven't had it in terms of you contradicted yourself. I had one fellow who wrote and said that he was sure that I was 1 year off in somebody's age, and I went back and checked my timeline, and I had to say, well, I think I'm right, but, because for most of the characters, I don't say today he is 23 and he will be turned 24 on this date. It's a little, you want to have a little bit of slop in there, to simply because, we don't go around telling each other our ages every day in real life.
Right.
I've had readers who were very upset with things that happened to characters or how books ended. And all you can say is, well, maybe this isn't the book for you. Maybe you need to find a different book that has an ending you like. But this is the way this story went for me.
Right.
So
that's a really interesting dilemma that we come to sometimes as writers, because I think we all want to be commercially successful. We wouldn't spend the time and effort and all of that if we didn't expect that people wanted to read what we're doing. I think there's writers will write for the love of writing, but there's an expectation that when we put this work into it, people are going to read it and hopefully enjoy it. But how do you balance that with your artistic integrity? And well, this is how the story is for me. You may not like it, but this is what's best for the character. Do you ever struggle with that?
Well, I think that for me, when I sit down to write a book, I know the beginning and the end, and I know some points in between, but I know the ending before I start to write. There's nothing worse than, investing 200 pages and saying, I don't know how this book ends. So I don't go there. It was an error I made often when I was younger, thinking I would find the ending. But you really do need to know the ending, even if you don't know how they get there. So in this day and age where there is so much feedback and instant feedback, and when you have readers saying, we're very unhappy because this didn't happen in your story and we hoped it would, I think it's hard sometimes to hang on to it and say, but this is the story as I know it, and I'm not going to suddenly make a left turn so that you can get your happy ending as you visualize it, because that's not true to the story or the characters. I think sometimes we see it in television series where I think sometimes writers are swayed by what they're hearing from the fan base, and then it for me the story gets kind of messy, and for me to follow every reader's suggestion would be that I have to take the characters and put a torque on them and say, now you're not going to do as you would ordinarily would, but you're going to do something to make this reader happy. I can't see that working.
And that really is a challenge nowadays, isn't it? That we're connected to the internet all the time, social media. is almost a necessity for writers to be able to keep in contact with their reader base. And I think, a lot of our marketing efforts are wrapped up in social media. And, a lot of times that's a two-way communication where maybe, earlier it was a lot of marketing was handled by the publisher, and it was, very traditional marketing channels. But now there is constant feedback coming back to the writer. How do you handle that?
Well, part of it is number one, I can't let it take over my writing hours. And social media, by the time you sit down and say, I should update my website. Oh, and now I should go to Facebook and tell people I updated my website. And then I should go to Twitter and I should put up a nice little snapshot on Instagram. And suddenly, your writing hours are being consumed by the social media that you are almost required to do to say, hey, look at me, I'm a writer. I think you have to keep it to a budget of time and keep it in perspective. And I stay away from reader reviews because I know I can't please anybody, so I may as well please myself. And I can't please everybody. And if I started reading all those reviews, I'm a typical writer. If they say 6 good things about me and 1 bad thing, I'm going to walk away remembering the bad thing.
Right.
So I do self-filtering of what I actually look at on social media. I do not allow social media onto my phone. I don't let my phone pop up with Facebook alerts or Twitters or things like that, simply because that's too intense.
Yeah.
I keep it on my desktop or my laptop so that when I come and choose to engage with it, I am engaging. But it's not something where I can be in the middle of a scene and suddenly I get, half a dozen Twitters or something that I'm tempted to look at. I just can't do that.
And that really is a healthy boundary, I think. I did that a while back, just took the apps off my phone because, before you know it, you're eating dinner with your family and then you're having this other side conversation with people that you can't see, and it all gets to be really bizarre. We really do live in challenging times that way.
Well, that split attention is, I don't think it does anybody any good. I mean, it's on the freeway. You can definitely tell who's using their phone. Mm-hmm. And even if they're, you watch them wander back and forth in their lane, they're just as bad as drunk drivers for the most part. And it claims a share of your attention that, because they're engaging you personally. It's, and if you engage with every single person who contacts you on social media, there's going to be nothing left for your writing or your real life or your family. You have to, I believe, set boundaries. And that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy interacting with readers. But there's a time and a place. If I go to a convention and I'm out there, I'm happy to talk to anybody, anytime. You can always stop me anywhere and catch me and say, please sign a book, or I'll run into you and say, hey, let's go for coffee and sit down and talk. I enjoy meeting readers and talking to people. But the right time for that is not in the middle of a family dinner or when I'm driving on the freeway or when I'm trying to write chapter 14.
Right. Back to your point a minute ago about planning out your novel. Are you a detailed outliner, or do you have? You said you knew the ending. You kind of know the middle. You know where you're beginning. Are those kind of loose guideposts, or do you have a detailed outline that you're working from?
Some of it depends on the editor I'm working with. Some editors like me to submit a chapter-by-chapter outline, and I do it knowing full well that it's going to change radically, but what I'm giving them is a map that says, I know at least one way to actually write this book and finish it. and that I've never felt an obligation to stick exactly to that outline. For the most part now, though, my editors trust me to be able to finish a book. And when I say it's a metaphor I've used before and very often, it's like going on a road trip or being in the forest, and you're standing on a ridge and you're looking across to another ridge, and you know that's where you have to be. That's the ending of your story. And in between, there's a valley that's full of fog. And maybe you see a tree sticking up here, and you can tell there's a water course over there. And you can see a few places that, you know, if you hit this and hit that and hit the other, that big boulder sticking up, you're gonna make it to the other ridge. But you don't know what's in between. You don't know if you're going to meet somebody, or if there's going to be, or if that river is going to be in full flood and you're not going to be able to cross it like you think you are. So it's a journey, and sometimes things change along the way, but ultimately you do know where you're bound.
Right. Some people that are adamant against outlining would say, well, when you know the ending and you outline it, it's like you're just writing the same book all over again, and they're not excited about the book anymore. How do you prevent that from happening?
Well, as I say, I can outline, but I never feel bound by it. So if something more exciting or interesting happens, or a character wanders through who's going to contribute their own note, I don't hesitate to include that. And I do agree that if I outlined it very specifically, chapter by chapter, scene by scene, and then tried to write it, I would get bored. And you don't want to be bored when you're writing your book. You want to be engaged fully with the world. So I think outlining is a useful tool. You know, in school they force you to outline everything.
Right.
And I hated doing outlines in school. But basically, it's a roadmap. It says, you know, one way to write this story or this paper. And right. So, you know, it gives you that fallback tool that if you get stuck, you can say, okay, I'm going back to the outline, and let's get the characters back on track.
How has the technology of writing changed the way you write as you've been following Fitz in these numerous books about him that you've written? You said you began writing him with a typewriter. I'm yes. assuming you're not writing on a typewriter still.
No, and I'll say what I wish I could remember who to attribute this quote to, but basically what word processing has done is it allows you to do more writing and less typing. When I first began writing, white paper, black ink, double-spaced, and you set the margins a certain way so that you produced a clean, crisp page. You used a good quality of paper. If you made more than three mistakes, you could go back and use whiteout. But more than three mistakes, and you really needed to take that page and retype it. And so if you were in the middle of chapter 14 and you suddenly thought, oh my goodness, if I made this happen in chapter 6, I could do a really cool thing now. You either had to go back and retype, not just chapter 6, but everything that followed chapter 6. Or you had to go back and say, oh, this is chapter 6, page 72A, 72B, 72C. Writing on a typewriter, and of course, you know, you're making your carbon copy at the same time. So if you get your carbon paper in backwards, that's a whole page that has to be retyped. When I first started, to make a Xerox copy of your manuscript was a substantial expense. You know, it was 10 cents a page for a Xerox. And you usually had to go, you know, for me, I was in an Alaskan village. It means a trip into town, and make sure you have plenty of coins to drop into that machine in the library or wherever you are, and make the Xerox, and then you're going to mail off the good copy and keep the Xerox for yourself and hope that the good copy doesn't get lost in the mail. So there was a lot to working at that end of it. Now it's very easy for me to move a section, go back, add a scene, change a scene. It's very easy compared to working with a typewriter. The danger is that sometimes it's a little too easy. You can play around with your story long past the time when you should have submitted it. It's also very easy to say, oh, I'm going to cut this scene and paste it somewhere, and instead you do a copy, and then you end up with the same scene in two places. But by the time you reread your manuscript, you're so familiar with what's going on there, you don't even notice that you have the same scene in two places till your editor says, what's going on here? Make a choice.
Right.
So there's drawbacks to it. But for the most part, I do love my word processor. One of the things I think that's going to be interesting for scholars is, and I'm not talking about my work, but I'm talking about how we can take a poem like Frost on Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and because of all his rough drafts are still extant, we can see how that developed from idea to finished product. I don't have anything like that. I type over stuff. I have probably, the story has probably been in 12 or 15 or 27 incarnations before I send it off to the editor. But nobody will ever see those files that I've typed over.
Oh, that's a great point. I haven't thought of that. Wow.
When you're analyzing stuff and this, and they're saying, oh, originally it had this ending, or originally this character was this or that. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what I changed or what I discarded, and nobody ever will know. Even my early rough drafts, which are now on floppies, nobody's going to take that 5 1/4 inch floppy or whatever it was, 3 1/2 inch disc. Nobody's going to go back and say, I'm going to, print this out to see what that very first submitted draft looked like.
Right.
It's all gone. It's just gone.
Well, now we know to look for your floppies one day. So.
Oh, they're in a box in the storage unit. And probably are unreadable. We were assured that CDs were like the ultimate way to store information, and now we know that, especially if you put a label on it, especially if you have a sticker label on those CDs, the shelf life on those is much less than paper.
Right.
So there's going to be a whole lot of stuff that, despite our internet and everything, it is going to have been lost.
Yeah.
And
it's sad.
Well, I don't particularly see it as a huge loss. Do I want people reading my rough drafts? Not really. No, I'd rather say this is the story as I liked it, and I'd rather you read that and not go back and see all these other incarnations of it.
Right. And Robert Frost probably wouldn't appreciate us digging through all of his rough drafts either. But such is life. You recently finished the third book in the Fitz and the Fool trilogy, it's coming out in this spring, isn't it? Book 2 just came out.
Book 2 is out. I have finished the draft for book 3, and it is with the editors, and I am awaiting anxiously their feedback on it. And I well know that this one needs a lot of work, so I'm looking forward to their help on what needs to be fixed.
Oh, how do you keep coming up with new situations to put Fitz in?
I don't really. Fitz kind of does things to himself. And again, when I say when you write a book, the ultimate endpoint. I have known Fitz's way stations along the way for a long time. So it's not necessarily I know everything in this book, and then after that I don't know everything. I know things that happened in the Six Duchies to Fitz Chivalry and to Berwick long before Fitz was born. And I know things that will happen there long after Fitz is gone. It's fun to look at a fantasy world with magic and say, okay, 300 years from now, 500 years from now, they're not riding horses around. They've developed other means of transportation, but they still have this magic. What's going to happen? And try to visualize those worlds and say, what happens as my fantasy world acquires more modern technology, but the magic still remains? Or does the magic go away? Or does it become against the law? Are you executed for using magic? Do they try to eliminate that genetic strain of people who have magic? Looking that far ahead, I think it's something all writers do. So do I look at the Six Duchies and know things that might possibly happen there 100 years from now? Sure, I do.
Are there more stories for Fitz coming up after this trilogy is finished?
Oh, so often I have said, no, this is the very last story, that I don't even speculate on that anymore. Writing Fitz is very intense because it is first person, and sometimes I need to take a breather from him and step out of his head for a while and write something else. And sometimes it's in the same world as the Rainwild Chronicles were, and sometimes it's in a completely different world. So we'll see.
Yeah. How intense is that, writing from the first-person perspective so much for this character? Like you just said, sometimes you need to clear your head. Do you find yourself just like, I'm too close to Fitz right now?
Well, there's odd things about it, and I'm sure that these are quirks that maybe are just my individual quirks. But, for instance, if I write a scene and I finish it, and I know that the next page-worthy scene doesn't happen for 2 days, I can't immediately start writing it. I need to get up and go outside and do some chores or sweep the floor and run some loads of laundry or whatever I do. But I have to take time away from the page to allow time to pass in their world. And that's my particular little quirk. I can't just do a time jump and then write the very next scene of what happened the next day. So I think I get very deep into Fitz's head. I've been writing Fitz for 20 years now. So no, closer to 25.
25, yeah.
Yeah. And so Fitz and the Fool and all of my characters, Molly and Patience and Burrick and Bee and all of them are very real to me and are very very close friends to me. So it is, for me, it's a very intense experience of writing. And sometimes I want to sit back and just dash off a short story or write some urban fantasy or something that's in a completely different vein. And I will do that, actually. Not a lot of it gets published, but I do write it.
Well, thank you for sharing Fitz with the rest of us. We appreciate you living in his world and bringing that to us for sure. Before we go, is there any piece of advice that you would give to maybe an author who is struggling to get their first work out? I don't really like the term. I don't like to think of people as perspective writers. I think either you're a writer or you're not. You may just not be published yet.
Exactly.
But what advice would you give to someone who's maybe discouraged, maybe just hasn't found their voice yet? Is there any one piece of advice you would give?
Well, and if you write, you're a writer. And if you have the desire to be a published writer, which is something that not every writer has, then you have to work at it. And I'll give you the same advice. If publication is your ultimate goal, study the markets and work at it every single day. Sit down and write something every single day. Make it have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Sometimes endings are very hard because you don't want to make that commitment and say, this is the way the story goes. And so you stop mid-story and say, oh, I'll finish that later. Don't. Write the ending, and then you will find out if it's the right ending or not by how either you'll like it or you won't like it, but you will have eliminated one possible ending that doesn't work for you. So I think it's really important to write and to finish your work and then to submit it. take the chance. The worst an editor can say to you is no thank you. And that's not going to make blood come out. You just go somewhere else and try again. Or you set it aside and you write something different and you try again. But you just keep on keeping on.
Right. If someone is not familiar with your work, there may be one or two people out there that are not familiar with your work. What book would you recommend them starting with?
I would always recommend Assassin's Apprentice because, chronologically speaking, it's at the beginning of the world. And so that is a very good entry point into the whole storyline.
Gotcha.
But if I do my best to make each trilogy stand independently. If you want to jump right in on Ship of Magic because you enjoy sea stories more, or if you want to try the Rain Wilds Chronicles, again, I've done my best to make those books satisfying reads on their own.
And your website is robinhobb.com. Can people there find all of your novels and follow the news of what's going on with you?
Yes, I don't update it near as often as I should, but I'm out on most social media as Robin Hobb or Real Robin Hobb, and if that interests you, I'm fairly easy to find.
Excellent. Robin Hobb, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, well, thank you for making me so welcome here.
Well, thanks for listening this week, and please be sure to visit our sponsors, Ellen Campbell, John Gregory Hancock, and Stefan Boltz. And stay tuned now for an audiobook snippet from The White Dragon Genesis by Stefan Boltz.
Sunday, 8:30 a.m. to 8:45 a.m. The first thing Casey noticed was that there was no window. From the outside, it had looked like a regular oversized display window like you find on most stores. From in here, she saw the windows were filled in with cinder blocks covered with large, colorful tapestries. "Looks real from the outside, doesn't it?" the man said. Casey felt a hint of déjà vu. It disappeared quickly. "We need some water, and I don't guess you have any antibiotics," she said. "Funny you should ask," the man said. "But come this way, unless you want to look for surfboards and vintage clothes. We've got shoes, too." With that, he looked at Blair. "Buy one pair, get the second one half off. It's a deal of the day. Or week. Come to think of it, I believe that particular deal was always available to my customers." Casey registered the English accent. She had lived in this town all her life, had walked the street hundreds of times, but had never come in here. It smelled a bit like mothballs. Her grandmother's house in Queens had the same slightly sweet smell radiating from her bedroom closet. The man led them through yet another door into a dark room. He turned the light switch and closed the door. A heavy-duty steel bar reinforced this door as well. "Bring the patient back here," he said. This room was twice the size of the store. The left side was basically a woodworking shop. There was a bandsaw, a large table saw, several workbenches, and wooden boards of all sizes leaning against the back. The wall on the right side of the room was covered in shelves. There were thousands of books, not only lined up on the shelves, but also stacked on the floor, piled on top of each other. A few chairs stood randomly amidst the chaos. The wall adjacent to the door held another set of shelves. Those had everything on them from several dozen one-gallon water bottles to canned beans, toothpaste, boxes of oatmeal, and large containers of spices and tea. "What the heck?" Erika said while holding an oversized can of tuna. "You better ask before you take anything," Blair said. The back corner held a small half bath and another shelf. This one was filled with first aid products, everything from gauze to peroxide to antibiotic cream. "Sit and let me take a look at you," the man said. "The rest of you take whatever you need. Eat, drink, use the restroom. We've got 15 minutes, and then we've got another hour, roughly." He looked at Casey when he said it, and at that moment she recognized him. "You're the man who gave me the amulet." It became quiet in the room. Erika, on his way to the shelf of food, stopped and turned around. Everyone looked at the man who had taken a few items from the first aid shelf and was spreading them on a large book on top of a stack of other books. "Yes, I did." I don't understand, Casey said. Let me take care of this young man first, and then I'll explain everything to you. Well, probably not everything, but some of it at least. I can help Jack, Jennifer said. I'm a doctor. He looked at her as if sizing her up for a second, then nodded. Why don't you all take a seat? I'd rather stand, Casey said, but I'd really like to know what's going on. She couldn't decide if his eyes were gray or blue, but they showed the wisdom of his years and revealed a deeper understanding of things, a sorrow that resonated with her. She was sure he'd seen his share of hardship. It looked as if his hair hadn't been touched by water or soap in a while. His face was weathered and his back bent slightly forward as if he had stood too long crouched over his work. It'll probably take them another 10 minutes to gather before they'll attack the outer door with everything they've got. By now they must be in possession of some military vehicles, and M2 can do some damage. Those are 2-inch steel reinforced doors, but they have their limits. Blair was leaning against one of the stacks of books, and Erika had sat down in a chair and was unwrapping a power bar. How fast we can accept as normal something that would have been impossible to comprehend only a few days ago, Casey thought. Then it'll take another half hour for the second door before they'll be in here. Is there another way out? Jennifer asked. She was cleaning Jack's face and swollen eye with a wipe. No, yes, and no. Both answers apply, depending on where you are. He looked as if he had just made a joke and now waited for a reaction from his audience. When his eyes found Casey's, his face changed. It became softer. It was as if he knew that what he was about to say should be said in kindness. I gave you the amulet, he continued. It was necessary. Trust me, I would not have brought this into your life if it wasn't of the utmost importance, and you have yet to accept it as yours. Nechrud has not been forged in this world. In fact, it has not even been forged yet, if you look at time as linear. Everyone was quiet. Then Erika coughed. Sorry, wrong pipe. He coughed again. I didn't get that last part. Could you repeat it? Nechrud. That's its name. Now you got to understand that in the place it was made, forged, where it was brought into existence, nothing is named unless its power has been recognized. The man cleared his throat. Excuse me, he said. He pulled a flask from one of his pockets and drank from it. He handed it to Blair. You look like you could use one. Blair took a sip. He started to cough. His face took on a dark red tone. What is that shit? I made it myself, the man replied. Do you have any questions? You can't be serious, Blair said. He was still coughing. Of course we have questions. The first of which would be, who the hell are you? I mean, don't get me wrong, your timing was impeccable, but... The man silenced him with a gesture. My name is Douglas McNamara. Casey, I apologize. Again. For what I've done, and for what I'm about to do to you. Jennifer looked up. She had been bandaging Jack's wrist with gauze. Now she looked like she was readying herself. When I gave you Nechrud, when I gave you the necklace with the amulet, I didn't come from, Douglas? Casey interrupted him. May I call you Douglas? Yes, he nodded. Please tell me what's going on and stop apologizing. He let out a sigh. You are not just your basic humdrum 18-year-old teenager. I didn't come to you 10 years ago because you were the only person on the beach that morning. Okay. Casey felt hot all of a sudden. I came specifically to you that day. The heat rose from her stomach, through her chest, and into her face. For God's sake, spit it out, Blair said. His eyes were still watery. You are a weapon, Casey. Well, not quite yet, but possibly in an hour or so, depending on if you agree to do what I'm about to ask you. Blair threw his hands in the air. Could you be more vague? Let him speak, Erika said. The world as you've known it, as we've known it, changed yesterday morning. It'll never be the same. And not just here. Everywhere in this country, Texas, L.A., New Hampshire, New Mexico, Florida, Louisiana, the Arctic Circle, overseas, everywhere. Something happened that set in motion a series of events which caused me to travel back here and give you the Nechrud. But the amulet is only one half. You are the other. One without the other has very limited power. but both together can yield a force that might help us. He took another sip from the flask. But you're not ready. Nowhere near ready. And in an hour or so, they'll come through that door. And if what you've seen so far has scared you, you will not want to find out what's next. The Blood Riders were scouts, the weakest link in a chain of... What do I have to do? Casey was surprised at her own question. She didn't think before she'd asked it, and now she almost regretted saying it out loud. Douglas took out a handkerchief and wiped sweat from his brow. Then he walked to the center of the room and moved a small Persian rug to the side, revealing the square outline of a trap door. Everyone stared at it for a moment. I'm assuming that doesn't lead to your wine cellar, Eureka said. That depends on who you are. Casey, tell me what you see, Douglas said. Casey took a few steps toward the open trap door. She looked over at Jack. He didn't look as bad as he did when they came in. His face had a little more color, and his left eye seemed less swollen. Smoke? She said. Fog, maybe? I can't see anything. What is it? You, with the glasses. What do you see? Douglas asked. Eureka got up and peered into the opening. A ladder. A cement floor. What? Casey asked. Are you sure? Some kind of crawl space, Blair added. Douglas gestured for Jennifer and Jack to come over. Crawl space, yes, Jennifer said. Jack nodded. Neither of you sees the fog? Casey stated. They shook their heads no. This down there, Douglas said, or up there, however you want to look at it, is a place where time is thinner than usual. Space folds into itself. It's a door, a gateway. To what? Casey asked. Jack, who stood next to her, took her hand. She took comfort in his touch and felt the urge to tell him how much she had missed him and that she was glad they were together now. The amulet without the carrier is worthless, Douglas continued, but the carrier has to be able to wield the power that both together brings forth. In order for it to help us, you need training. Training? What kind of training? You have to go through extensive physical training, and I mean extensive. You'll have to be able to withstand pain, heat, cold. You'll have to go past your fear, far past it. You'll have to learn how to discipline your mind. That'll be the hardest part. That which you will invite and which you will become will obliterate you if you're not prepared. It will take over and nothing of you will be left. Casey remembered the encounter in the dark basement from this morning all too well, and when she had tried to free the horses and couldn't control whatever it was that had come to her. And you want me to do all that in an hour? Casey asked. No, not an hour. That would be impossible. 3 years. What? Blair exclaimed. What the hell are you talking about? There's an ancient training ground, not here, not now, in a distant past, somewhere else entirely. It's there solely to train those who can be used, formed, forged, if you will, into weapons to fight, to help us fight. Come again? Blair said after a moment of silence. Here, in this room, 1 hour will pass. But there, 3 years will have gone by before your training is completed and you can come back to us. The heat in Casey's chest had turned into a block of fast freezing ice. She had trouble breathing. I'm sorry, Douglas said, but the White Dragon is vast and powerful and you have to become its equal before it can become you. What's the White Dragon? The White Dragon is the purpose of your journey. To find it, to tame it, and to bring it back. There was no sound in the room. Casey looked into the fog just below the floor. Where do I find it? Douglas shrugged. I don't know. No one does. Casey looked from one to the other. She had trouble wrapping her mind around what Douglas had said. She had so many questions, but none of them had to do with what she felt she needed to do. Okay, I'll do it. I'm coming with you, Jack said. Douglas smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The one who has been touched by love knows pain. But unfortunately, if you jumped in there, you'd most likely break your ankles on the concrete floor. And me? Casey asked. I don't know where you'll land, or when. How do I get back? There's a way, but if I tell you now, which I can't because I don't know it, you wouldn't be able to make any sense out of it. What do I take with me? Nothing. No possessions, no clothes. The amulet is the only thing you can keep. It'll be your guide. A loud bang shook the fluorescent lights in the ceiling. It was a single blow. If you're willing to do this, you have to do it now. I don't know how long it will take them to get through the doors, but if you do, and you're still in here, they can shut the door and seal the entrance, and you'll be stuck in there forever. Casey realized that she'd been squeezing Jack's hand the whole time. He didn't say anything. Okay. Douglas nodded. Casey hugged him. I'll see you in an hour, he said. From him, she went to Eureka and hugged him. You should take another bite, he said, holding yet another power bar in his hand. And bring me a souvenir, okay? Some kind of ancient, I don't know, bottle opener or a Swiss Army knife or something? Sure. Blair hugged her hard and quick. Thanks, he said. Jennifer shook Casey's hand. I'll hug you when you get back, she said. When she stood in front of Jack, she was nervous all of a sudden. There was something I wanted to do, he began, and I just never got around to it. And now that you're... Before he could continue, she kissed him on the mouth. His lips were soft and they trembled. She didn't know if it was from the pain, so she withdrew just a little bit, but he kissed her back. The stuttering sound of the M2 reverberated in the room. She withdrew from him. See you soon, Jack said. See you in an hour, Casey replied. She began to untie her boots. Guys, give the girl some privacy, Jennifer said. Turn your asses around, gentlemen. Douglas, Jack, Eureka, and Blair turned around. Casey took off her boots, pants, and tank top. She still had her bikini on. She slipped it off. I'm going to hold it until you're back. Don't worry, Jennifer said. I won't let any of the boys touch it. She and Casey exchanged a brief smile. You're a warrior, Casey, Jennifer said, and I'd go into battle with you any time. Casey looked from her down into the fog. Don't think, just do it. In the deep crevices of her mind, something stirred. It felt alien still, but its power brushed against her like air on a feather. She jumped.